Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this week's episode of the Sky Sports F1 podcast with me, Matt Baker. Now, on the day that Brad Pitt announces the release of his June F1 movie for next year, I thought we'd assemble our very own blockbuster guests. Did you like that? To join us on the podcast this week, Bernie, Collins, and Ted Kravitz. Hello to both of you. Ted, you're quite a keen follower of that film, aren't you? You've been remarking upon it when it's been filming, up and down the paddock. Will you be seeing it?
Yes. Hello, Matt. Hello, Bernie. Hello, everybody. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? As yet, still untitled, but co-produced between Brad Pitt and Lewis Hamilton. So we know that they've been shooting. Well, we saw them shooting at the races last year. They've been doing what they call in the business, Matthew, B-roll, which is track shots. So they did that in some races this year, did it in Japan. So they had a tracking camera, and I think they were at Australia as well. And as I understand it, they've been hiring out various circuits empty throughout the world and filming the rest of the movie, all the action sequences that we don't know. So we still don't know what it's called, but we do have a proposed date, which is June next year.
Yeah, very exciting. Bernie, are you also excited? You've been a little bit involved with the film as well?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of consultancy work, so it's been really exciting to see it. Obviously, they've had a massive break in filming because of their writer's strike, which is now back on again, or, they're back on filming again. So I think, the second half of the year, we're going to see them back at more tracks, more of the garage stuff. So yeah, really exciting to see the finished thing all come together for next year. So I'll definitely be going along to watch that.
Yeah, an F1 movie is very exciting for all of us, I'm sure, who work in F1, but not just us as well. Right, here's what's coming up. So I thought we'd try and answer the question of what will F1 look like over the next couple of years. And it's a big question, I know, but we're going to try and split it into two parts. The first part being the 2025 grid, which is starting to take shape. We've had a bit of movement on that over the last couple of weeks. And then we're going to discuss the 26 regulations, which I know came out just before Canada, but it'd be good. The first chance we've had to really discuss them on the podcast. So I thought we'd go into those as well. Let's start with the 2025 grid. And I sort of was assembling my list here and trying to look at which teams are definitely locked and loaded for 2025. And I think it's only Ferrari and McLaren at the moment. Ferrari with Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, and McLaren with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. I think all the other teams, unless you either of you
are Red Bull finished now because Max has signed and is that an open goal
leads us
question?
Perfectly into the first question, Bernie. Yeah, I mean, what's your view on that, Bernie? Do you think that Red Bull seat is pretty much is Max's, right? It would still be shocking, wouldn't it, if he didn't race for them in 2025?
What they're going to say is contractually he's signed for 2025, so they're potentially going to say that seat is locked. We know there's caveats. We've heard little bits of caveats in his contract that he can leave if certain conditions are met. Yeah, I think for 25, that's probably his preferred seat, just if you look at the performance of how the cars are going. But the question marks remain on 26 with the new regs, which we'll get into in a bit. But yeah, I can't see him going anywhere else. But also, I didn't see Lewis going anywhere else. So what do I know, basically?
In this funny old world of Formula One. Ted, what's your view on that other Red Bull seat now that Sergio Perez, of course, has signed an extension to his contract?
Yeah, so Bernie's absolutely correct in that, Checo is there. Max can leave if certain conditions, as Bernie said, are met. One of those conditions is if he just feels like it. The other condition is what happens with Helmut Marko. If he goes, then Max can go. So, it is one of those sort of Sebastian Vettel style. I don't mean that in the style of Sebastian Vettel. I mean the same kind of contract that Sebastian Vettel had at Red Bull, which allowed him to go to Ferrari, is more or less the same thing with get-out clauses either way that Max Verstappen has. But in a sense, the only person that Max Verstappen needs to worry about in his freedom to move to Mercedes, if he believes, which we believe some of the Verstappen camp do, that Mercedes will be the best place for the new rules set that we're going to talk about in 2026. The only thing Max has to worry about, whether he needs to get his bottom in that seat early, is an 18-year-old, no, not quite 18, 17-year-old Italian called Kimi Antonelli, who hasn't decided whether, or Toto Wolff hasn't decided whether he's going to take his seat. So if Max sees the possibility of not getting in that seat and making it harder for himself in 2026 because Antonelli and Russell are already in the team, then that's the only reason why Max might, at the end of this year or towards the end of this year or even beginning of next, say, okay, helmet is off if that's the mechanism he chooses to leave. I would like to go to Mercedes. That's what I'm going to do. So, but if he still thinks that he can race for Red Bull Racing in 2025, and his concerns about 2026 are unfounded, that he can continue up to the end of his contract anyway, or B, if he thinks that there's a device or mechanism by which he can move one of the Mercedes drivers, if he still chooses to go there in 2026, then I suppose he could stay for 2025. But yeah, that's something that he'll have to think about and something we won't know for the rest of the season. So lots of conjecture and hypotheticals in there. But I agree with Bernie. I think we can more or less say that it'll be Verstappen and Perez for Red Bull next year. I'm 99% sure. I'll leave myself 1%, get out.
Yeah, always leave 1% in Formula One. I guess the problem that Max would have if Antonelli does come in is Antonelli is the future of Mercedes, right? He's the young kid who's going to see that team through, unless of course he replaces George Russell. That's a whole other conversation for another day. But look, Bernie, while we're on the subject of Antonelli, what sort of checks and balances are going on at the moment, do you think, at Mercedes to kind of assess how ready Kimi Antonelli is for that Mercedes seat?
Well, yeah, there's going to be quite a lot going on in the background. There'll be all the simulator running. Of course, that's happening. There's quite an extensive, we think, test program going on in sort of, what's classed as an historic car, which is basically older than 2 years ago. So there's a lot of work going on, I think, in the background to get him up to speed, to get some analysis done, to see where he's at. I think we're getting the impression potentially that there's a fear on missing out on the next Verstappen, that they want to put the back into someone young and then bring them through the program, and then potentially in a few years' time that is the next Verstappen. So I think there's that sort of fear around missing out on getting Kimi into that seat, and that's potentially why there'd be this push to maybe put him in the seat a little bit before potentially he's ready. Now, is there something that they can play with the Williams seat? Can he go to Williams for the second half of a year, for example, then get into the Mercedes seat? We've seen that happen in the past. It happened with George. He did a few years at Williams, then he moved to Mercedes. Was that successful as just putting him straight in the Mercedes? We don't know. We don't have a back-to-back on that. But there's a lot of questions going on around that, I think, in the Mercedes camp at the minute.
Which is weird in a sense, Matt, because we're expecting there to be no room at the inn at Williams, are we? We're expecting them to confirm Alex Albon's partner will be Carlos Sainz fairly shortly. So what then does James Vowles and Toto Wolff know that we don't? Do they know that it's highly unlikely, 99% you might say unlikely, that Max Verstappen is going to come to Mercedes and leave Red Bull? Maybe they do know that. And that's given them the freedom then to fill both the Williams drives and then potentially the Mercedes drives as well.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah, no, you're right. There's a lot of moving parts, I guess, still ultimately, and this was a reason, I guess, earlier in the season why we had this sort of block on driver moves, was Max still does hold the key. What Max does seems to unlock a lot of the rest of the grid and how the rest of the grid looks. If we move away from Mercedes and from Red Bull and start to look at some of the other teams, Aston Martin, and I think this is a really interesting debate and conversation that's ongoing, and Lance Stroll was quite on it in the press conference, wasn't he, in Canada, saying is a question I keep getting asked at the moment, what's happening with my future. He's not, has he, Ted, firmly said, I will be driving for Aston Martin in 2025? Has he?
No, he hasn't. But then I don't think that's because he's thinking about not driving. I think that's just because he doesn't want to give the impression that it's just done because his dad is one of the people who owns the team. He earns his place through scoring points, and he's proud of his performances. And when he goes well, he's an absolutely fantastic addition to that team. Is a regular point scorer. So I think that's more that he doesn't want. He's a modest man, Lance is, and he doesn't want it to be, well, of course I'm here. He wants to be able to earn it. But yeah, I would imagine it's also, well, I mean, I'd say 100%. Should we start to lock these down, Matt? So we've already locked Red.
Well, we haven't, because it said
Red Bull.
99.
We've already locked Red Bull, Verstappen and Perez. Come on. Should we lock Williams down, Bernie? You happy with Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm less sure of that one, but let's say yes. Yes,
Okay.
say yes.
All right, Bernie's on the fence, but I'll lock Williams down. Come on, Matt, we've got 10 of these. We've got to move it along.
All right,
I'll lock
fine,
Aston Martin down. I'll lock Aston Martin down.
I'm happy with Aston.
Stroll.
Shall we move on to a team that definitely isn't locked down? And that's Alpine. Because we're hearing reports today, Autosport reporting that Alpine is considering abandoning its Works Renault engine for F1 from 26. It's now opening talks, allegedly, with other manufacturers to become a customer team and use one of their engines. And I guess, Bernie, if you're trying to attract the talent to your team, at the moment, neither Alpine don't have a driver signed on for next year. This can't be great in the sales pitch, can it? Going, oh, actually, perhaps our engine isn't as good as we thought, therefore we're going to try and buy one off another manufacturer.
No, it's attractive if they get a better engine. Sorry, Bernie. Not again.
No, it's fine. I was going to let you go ahead there, Ted. But
go.
I think, it is difficult because it depends on the driver, right? So someone like Max, Carlos is looking ahead. They're looking beyond 2025. They're looking at 2026 when we get the new engine regs. There's loads of unknowns with that, which we'll get into in a little bit. But yeah, the Renault engine isn't as strong as the others currently, or the Alpine engine, depending on what we're calling it. We don't know what 2026 is going to look like. There was discussion, I read somewhere, that maybe they'll take the new Red Bull power unit, but there's lots of rumours that that's not great either. So I think you're right. As a sales pitch, when you don't know what the engine's going to be, or the plan is for not that far away, yes, they've not been allowed to work on the chassis of these cars yet because of the regulations, but there's a lot that goes on around an engine to make that, to get that in the car, to make it fit whatever your gearbox is going to be. There's a lot more discussion happen. So to not know that for a year and a half away is an issue. That is fundamentally an issue. If the rumours that they're not going to continue with the Works engine is correct.
So I think the issue here is the future of Viry-Châtillon. So that's where Renault have always made their engines. They were Renault, then they were Mechachrome, Supertech, and supplied all sorts of people. Now they're Renault again. And I think what Luca De Meo, the Renault boss, is seeing is that there is a lot more of a need to get engines and hybrid units and electric motors into the automotive world. And there's more value in that than continuing an engine program for Formula One that isn't very successful. By their own admission, they're about 15 horsepower down. Then they're the weakest power unit on the grid, Renault. So I think what Luca De Meo is saying, look, I'm happy to keep on Renault as a constructor in Formula One. I want a better engine. Engines are frozen, so I don't think we're going to get them out of Viry-Châtillon. Let's hive off Viry-Châtillon to a new engine agreement with the Chinese concern Geely, which I have or is it Geely, which I have the press release about here. So it's not just Autosport who are reporting it, Matt. It's actually a Renault press release here, with all respect to Autosport. And what they're deciding is that we'll get a Honda engine, or we'll get a Red Bull Powertrains engine, or whatever. And to that end, circling back, as they say, to the drivers. The involvement of Geely as a Chinese company, and also obviously they make Volvo. They have a stake in Mitsubishi. They have various other people. I'm reading in this press release about who that potentially this partnership will make engines for. It's called Horse, by the way, Horse Powertrains, or is it HORSE? It's horse in capital letters, isn't it, Matt? Bernie. So it's
powerful horse.
It's not sure, but Luca De Meo says that through the Horse Powertrains, Renault Group will achieve worldwide leadership and scale in the sector, more than 80% of its business. So they make lots of other. Here we go: Geely Auto, Volvo Cars, Proton, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. They'll be making engines for that. But with that link up with the Chinese company, would it be so outrageous to suggest that Geely might want to leverage their involvement in a Renault link-up within Formula One by employing Zhou Guanyu as one of their drivers to do some sort of marketing and promotional. Very good driver, maybe not a Max Verstappen, but then who is? And I would say Gasly and Zhou Guanyu in Alpine next year.
Interesting, yes, with the Chinese link. Just going back onto horsepower, you do wonder why an engine manufacturer hasn't been called Horse before. It seems an obvious choice for a company, but anyway.
But did you know that 2026, whose rules we are getting onto in a minute, Matt, is the Chinese Year of the Horse?
Well, there you go. Funny how these things happen, isn't it? Bernie, and would the likes of Jack Doohan, Mick Schumacher be unlucky to miss out on that Alpine seat?
I think
if perhaps they did go with Zhou Guanyu.
Yeah, I think they will feel unlucky 100%. You know, someone like Jack Doohan has done a lot of work in the background. He's at a lot of the tracks, putting in the hours definitely to try and get into a seat like that. But, you know, not necessarily. And unfortunately, that's how elements of these things work. Elements of these things are connection and manufacturers and who they want in their seats. So, you know, I totally back what Ted's saying there as an option for that. But hopefully, and we'll probably get onto it, we do see some of the young drivers that have made an appearance in practice sessions on the grid, because there's a lot of talent out there that we think deserve drives on the grid.
Yeah, we're perhaps overdue, aren't we? A couple of young guys coming through. But look, let's move on, because they're someone who is going to be driving an FP1 this weekend in Barcelona is Ollie Behrman for Haas, and that feels as if that is almost a done deal that he will drive for Haas next year. I guess then, Ted, who takes the other seat? Who would be a good option for Haas in the other seat?
Well, Haas need to go and find some already open doors to knock on and see.
This is a podcast of bad jokes so far.
If they open, and yes, sorry, it's Behrman and Ocon making, I think, the equal highest, tallest driver pairing in Formula One history, both over 182 centimeters. Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon, and now only a job for the Haas designers to fit the two tall frames into a Formula One car. But yeah, the way Ayuko Komatsu, the Haas boss, has been talking about the qualities of Esteban Ocon to anybody who asked in Canada makes me pretty much convinced that it's Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon there next year.
Okay. Kind of happy to lock that one in as much as we can.
Well, I am. Bernie, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll go with you on that one, Ted. Trust Ted. Always trust Ted.
No.
Trust Ted.
Worst thing you can possibly
99% Ted.
We'll call it 99%.
Yeah, 99%. All right. Bernie, RB
yes.
is, and actually while we were talking about sort of reserve drivers, those young guys in the background, Liam Lawson has obviously been in the car replacing Daniel Ricciardo for a few races last year, was impressive. And I wonder if perhaps he is one of the most frustrated of those reserve drivers, looking at that lineup and going, the way Daniel's performing at the moment, should he be in with a shot of that second seat at RB? Yeah,
Liam's he did a marvellous job last year. The races that he stood in when Daniel was unwell, really stepped up to the mark there, was very cool, calm, collected, ended up scoring points. When the team had really struggled for points so far last season. So, that was the best sort of interview I thought he could have given, really, for that role. And then probably felt quite disappointed at the end of the year with how the pairing looked for this year. And then through this year has probably been quite hopeful of something changing again. Now, we don't really know how that's going to pair out. Maybe Ted knows. Ted probably knows. But it's that, that is a seat that he's been lingering in the background of. And for someone in his position, if he doesn't get the seat for 2025, then does he start to look outside the Red Bull family? And that's a big question mark, because how long, there's 2 seasons now that he probably feels he should have been in a seat, he could have been in a drive, and if he's to miss out on a third one, that's not great for your career going forward. So I don't know if he hangs on indefinitely to the Red Bull family.
Are there any other options, Ted, for Liam, do you think, up and down the grid?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on Daniel Ricciardo, doesn't it? So Yuki Tsunoda is confirmed for RB for next year. If Ricciardo's performances pick up in the style that they did in Canada, then I think that he will stay at RB. They seem happy to keep him. Red Bull Racing, who's obviously, they're all Red Bull Racing drivers. They seem happy for Daniel Ricciardo to stay if, and that's a big if his performances keep up like Canada, if he keeps scoring points. If Ricciardo doesn't and has a major slump, then I think Lawson will go into RB. But if Ricciardo does stay, then consider, have you ever been to a big Red Bull event, Matthew or Bernie? And have you seen the VIPs arriving in big Red Bull events? And do you know what cars they arrive in? Do you know what deal that Red Bull have for some road cars, a link up?
No, go on.
Take a wild guess. It's a German company.
Audis.
Yes. So obviously there was potentially a link up between Porsche. So the Volkswagen Group has been a long-term partner of Red Bull corporate. And there was the potential link up with Porsche didn't work out. That doesn't mean that the Red Bull company does not still retain very good links with Audi, which they do. So I can see maybe having lost out on potentially Carlos Sainz, Red Bull might go, Marco or Christian Horner might go to Audi and say, look, if you don't want to keep Valtteri Bottas, how about Liam Lawson? Or indeed the reverse, if they wanted to move Daniel Ricciardo on. But I'm not sure whether Ricardo Hülkenberg would be quite what Audi would want. I think the appeal of a young charger in Lawson backed by Red Bull, with Red Bull's grace and maybe, giving them something to go in there. And the experience of Hülkenberg might be up Audi's street.
Yeah, nice. Okay, and that's a perfect segue into the final of the teams, which is Kick Sauber / Audi, which it will be from 25. As to who would be a good fit in there, I guess, Bernie, it's a similar question to Alpine, isn't it? Because is that quite a tough sell in that it is an untried and untested project? Who is going to be attracted to that project? It probably is a young, hungry driver, isn't it? Really, someone like Liam Lawson.
Yeah, I think that's who's attracted to the project for sure. You look at their performances from a chassis side this year and it's not great. Even things, like the pit stop's not going well. Those sorts of things potentially continue forward with the team, depending on how good the engine is. So there's aspects there that are going to be a challenge as a driver, as well as that to bring on a new engine with new regulations. That is a challenge. So from the team side, potentially to get the best out of the engine, the best development, whatever the case may be, having a more experienced driver. Now, they've got Hülkenberg there. He's driven a number of engines on the grid. So there's a good understanding of how things work. Now, obviously, it's going to be different. We'll get onto that in a bit. But that mix of experience and youth is probably quite good in a team.
Okay, well, look, semi-locked. some of them are. There is still quite a lot to be decided, isn't there? And look, it could all change if Max Verstappen decides he's going to leave Red Bull. Then that really does set the cat amongst the pigeons, doesn't it?
Should we recap? I feel like you're getting to the end of the section, Matthew, and I feel we are. I feel we should recap. I've got my pages of the notebook, so I'm reminded which teams there are because there are some we've left out because they're obviously already there. So Red Bull was saying Verstappen and Perez.
Yep.
Mercedes, we're saying Antonelli and Russell.
Currently, yes.
Okay. Ferrari, of course, is Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. We didn't mention them. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, you've already said McLaren. Yeah. Aston Martin, we're saying no change. Alonso and Stroll. Alpine, we're saying, I'm saying Gasly and Zhou. What did you want to put an alternative, Matt?
Gasly and Doohan. Okay. Hopefully we're going to get Jack on the podcast in a few weeks' time.
But are we sure Pierre's going to stay? Bernie, can you give us?
I'm convinced by your Zhou argument actually, and the links that exist there.
Yeah, I just think that's a big sign up between Renault and Geely Automotive.
Yeah,
and Renault. In fact, quite a lot of European manufacturers need the Chinese automotive market now, and whether it's Geely or the other brands, BYD or whoever it is, the Chinese brands don't need Volkswagen and Renault and people to bring their expertise in China and help them build cars anymore. the Chinese companies know, and they build brilliant cars. And it's the other way around now. The European markets need the Chinese companies to help them build cars. So I just think if he's a very good racing, he's a good racing driver, perfectly good racing driver, Zhou Guanyu. I just think maybe to sort of square that circle. Anyway, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, Pierre Gasly.
Yeah.
Williams, Albon and Sainz.
Yeah. We'll say that.
Big call for Sainz, but there you go. RB. So what are we saying? Ricardo and Yuki. If not, then Lawson and Yuki. Okay. Yeah. Audi, possibly Lawson and Hulkenberg. If not, Hulkenberg and Bottas. No.
Yeah.
Ricardo. We have forgotten about Valtteri Bottas in here. And Haas.
Well, he's too busy winning cycling races.
And Haas, Mr. Tall and Mr. Other very tall. Yeah. Behrman and Ocon.
There we go. Clear as mud, everyone, if you're listening. I guess the problem is for the likes of Ricciardo is now that the season has moved or the silly season, that the driver market has happened so early with Hamilton going to Ferrari in January, that it feels like it's all happened a lot earlier this season, and you don't get 10, 12, 14 races now to prove your worth in a team. I feel like you've got to be there now, you've got to be part of the conversation now.
Well, yeah, and can we say that then potentially it could be 3 current drivers moving into other series, not Formula One? Kevin Magnussen, potentially Daniel Ricciardo, and potentially maybe Zhou Guanyu, but Valtteri Bottas. And that's an interesting question you say, Mackie. You might have mentioned it in a sort of jokey way, but with a lot of his extra Formula One stuff doing cycling races, is Valtteri sending a strange message, or is that message being misinterpreted by the Piranha Club of team bosses thinking, he's sort of doesn't seem to be very interested in Formula One anymore and seems to be loving life more as support, as cycling and doing his coffee and wine and gin and other stuff. Do you think there's a danger of that? That's just an open question, because I don't know. I know Valtteri fairly well, and I know that he's very extremely committed to making the Sauber a faster race car, and he loves racing and scoring points. But I wonder if there's a perception out there that he's just interested in other stuff now. What do you think?
I think it's a very interesting question. Bernie, I'll probably refer to you on that. I guess actually a good question is if you were his strategist and you saw him week in, week out kind of doing all these other things, would you perhaps start to question his commitment in that sense?
I think that's a more difficult question, because actually as a strategist you see them turn up at the track, so your main interaction with that person is at the track in the engineer meetings, and you've got this whole image that we don't see of how much they're pushing in the meetings, how many reports they're reading, the questions they're asking, how many times they're showing up at the factory in between races, all these other things that we don't see. And he's not advertising that. Some drivers post pictures of their simulator sessions. Bottas is not doing that. Does that mean he's not doing the simulator sessions? I doubt it. So I think in the team, actually, you've got a much better picture of the driver and how they're doing. Externally, what I would look at as a strategist thinking he might be coming to us next year is their radio comms in the car, not their Instagram feed. So I actually look at how they're communicating with the pit wall, the feedback they're giving, those sorts of things. That's the best advertisement of a driver. And then aside from that, and I will stop answering the question in a minute, is a happy driver, settled, focused. It's a fitness thing he's doing as well. It's got to help him in the car, his reactions and things. It's not like, maybe not the gin, but the cycling is a fitness thing as well. It's got to be helping him in the car. And just having that, some of the drivers that I worked with, the best, had this very outside life that they could relax, decompress, and not be the sole focus on the next event. So I think, for me, that wouldn't be off-putting if I was looking to recruit him. There'd be other things I'd be looking at.
And his race performances are very good when the car is allowing. And Valtteri Bottas is, I will go out on a limb here, maybe it's not much of a limb, say I think he's the fittest driver on the grid. He must be.
I think unquestionably.
Unquestionably, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the races he's won, the cycling with the gravel races he's won are really impressive. 5 hours of cycling. Yeah, you can check it out on Strava. We did have a chat about that a few weeks ago on the podcast. Right, let's move on, shall we, to the 26 regulations. And look, as I said at the top, I know these came out just before Canada, but I think it's a good opportunity to work out what it kind of means for the cars, how they're going to look, how they're going to sound, how they're going to feel going forward into 2026. Before we get on to those specifically, Bernie, I just had a question for you, really, in terms of when you were in a team, how does a team deal with the regulation change? Do you have like a kind of task force of senior leaders who kind of go, right, we're going to make it our mission? And I appreciate that they can't work on them for another year, but that doesn't surely stop water cooler conversations going, well, we could try this, or this has crossed my mind.
Yeah, I think, it is. So the first thing to say is you're right. It is locked down that they're not supposed to start on the regulations until January next year. A lot of that is because the regulations are still fluid. So some of what goes on is we've had it many times in the past, from technical regulations to sporting regulations, where you get one set of regulations, you start working on those, then the next version of regulations is different. So a lot of the work you've done is null and void. But the way that design offices normally do it is you have, or a lot of them do it, that you have a chief designer working on the current car, or in this case, probably working on the current car and the year after. And you'll have another sort of much smaller group of designers that are looking further ahead. They're doing the research projects, they're working on the 2026 car. And we know that teams have been involved working with the FIA to give advice on the rules. So the FIA are coming up with regulations, teams are giving their feedback from their simulations and their models. So there will be people and teams, with a forward look at those sorts of things, probably because they're interacting with the FIA in that way. So that's how teams do it. They will have a smaller team. And as we get closer to the regulations, so as we start to move through 25, when they're allowed to officially start working on it, that team working on the 26 car will grow and the team working on the 25 car will shrink. So gradually, different departments, more of the percentage of work will shift. And it's sort of this gradual shift as they go through the year and they stop doing upgrades. Very
interesting. Right. So you start to see how a new car is born, essentially, and how the workforce is split. Ted, so in terms of what the cars will look like, let's start with the sort of visual. So 30 kilos lighter. The wheelbase has been reduced by 200 mil, and the width has been reduced by 100 mil. We're going to keep the same tyres, but they're going to be slightly narrower on the front and on the rear. In terms of what they look, do you think fans will sit there and go, that is a distinctly different looking car? Because from the 21 to 22, those were very, very different looking cars. Just from what I've seen on the kind of CAD mock-ups, they seem to look quite similar.
Yeah, 10 centimeters narrower is noticeable, isn't it? I don't think you'll notice the length, and you won't notice the weight. Not that everybody will be able to save the full 30 kilos. We'll see if that survives the final rules. But what people will most notice is when the front and the rear wings start moving on the straights, and it'll be like, oh, it's like those fancy road cars where you see on the motorway sometimes if you're following a particularly rich person, their wings suddenly move like that. What's going on there? And that's going to make our job the most important. That's where we're going to need to explain with these movable wings, first time in Formula One history, or at least intentionally movable, that we're going to have these sort of weird active aerodynamics cars. And we're going to have to explain to people, look, they're doing that because the way that the engines, the power units are now, they need to we need to make the cars less draggy. So we need to cut the drag because the way that the engines are, they need to harvest some electricity while going on the straight, because it's just the way that they're working. And you might find to do that, you just need to it's a bit like the dynamo on a bike. You need to lean it against the wheels or the engine, just a little bit, a little trickle sometimes on the straights to make sure that you've got, at certain circuits, to make sure you've got enough battery, because there's so much more coming from the battery. And the way that we used to generate electricity, which was the MGUH, which was the little turbine that would run off the turbo, that's gone for 2026. So you've got to find a replacement. And the energy that you could generate, the electricity you could generate from that MGUH was unlimited, and still is. It's unlimited. Whereas there's only a certain amount you can generate under under braking using the MGUK, the motor generator unit kinetic. So all of that unlimited electricity you could generate off the turbo, now gone. You've got to generate a lot more using the MGUK. So to do that, you need to do a bit on the straight. To do that, you need to make the cars very low drag. And to do that, these low drag cars, do you remember, you're probably too young to remember this, both of you, but BAR Honda did a world land speed attempt on the Bonneville salt flats when Jenson Button and Takuma Sato were driving the race cars. And they got the FIA medical safety car driver, Alan van der Merwe, to drive it. And to do a world speed record attempt with a Formula One car, they needed to essentially cut down the wings. That car was so low drag, it was still not as low drag as these cars in 2026 are going to have to be. And that only had like a sort of small element rear wing. So I wish I had something to show you what the cars are going to look like. But I don't. But in place of it, I'll have one of my kids' toy cars where look at the angle of that rear wing. You see that? It's pretty much flat. Old little happy Ferrari there. And they won't be flat. Obviously, the rear wings won't be flat. That would satisfy, or rather get the cars to their low drag configuration they need to be. But of course, it wouldn't work for when they go around corners. You need to have a bit more of a rear wing. So you're going to see the rear wing popping up in corners and then being flat on the straights. And to have that, we have our modes. When are we going to get onto the modes, Matt? Because I have some explanation. Do you want to ask Bernie something while I talk before we get onto the modes?
I think you've summarised what we're going to see.
What we're going to see.
Well,
yes,
yeah, and I think, but Bernie, in terms of there seems quite a lot of, obviously the DRS to my mind, to my uneducated, non-scientific mind, the DRS is quite a simple mechanism, right? It's a flap that just is pulled, and occasionally we see DRS issues. But generally, they're always resolved quite quickly. Very, very rarely does someone retire from a race with a DRS issue. If we're going to have the front wing, the rear wing, we're going to have these elements all moving. It feels like quite an advanced car with potentially quite a lot to go wrong. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah, fair? It's a big step. We've had DRS for a long time now. Maybe Ted knows exactly how long. We had DRS for a long time. We've seen more DRS issues at the beginning. Gradually over time, we've got a lot better at it. It's, standard fit these days. Teams internally will have had, there's been many times in the past where a rear wing has come a little bit oversized, bits of a sticky DRS. You've had to go through the problem of sorting it out. But yes, this is going to be much more complex from an aero point of view. Complex mechanically in how both ends of the car are working, that it's, working all the time repeatedly, lap after lap. It's going to be activated much, much more. It's going to be every straight, every lap of the race. So the usage, even if it was just the rear flap, the usage is much higher than we get in the current DRS because it'll be happening much, much more regularly. So that bit of it's complex. Mechanically, it's complex. Additionally, it's complex in terms of where exactly how exactly do you start to add on the downforce coming into a corner? How quickly can you take the downforce off coming out of a corner? So how the cars are operating in different corners is going to be much more complex than we have currently. So there's quite a lot going on there to ensure that reliably the driver has what they expect going into a corner, onto a straight, and that's some of the concerns. And with all that extra mechanical complexity of all of the wings moving, I personally at this stage fail to see the 30 kilos being realised, because the car without the engine, just the aero in the car, is a lot more moving parts than we have at the minute, and that all adds weight.
Well, and then the MGUK, because it has to do all this work, has to be much heavier, and it needs to be, it's going to be 20 kilos minimum heavier. So you're actually asking the teams to absorb the 20 kilos, maybe another 10 kilos on the front DRS and the rear DRS, and then save 30 from that. So yeah, I agree with Bernie. It's almost impossible.
It's the first time that we've really had engine regs driving chassis regs. There's a push to have more electrical power on the engine, and that is what's driving, as Ted explained quite well, why we need the adaptable aero.
Ted, this is probably linked to your modes piece that you're about to say. There's going to be a lot of importance placed, isn't there, on for the viewer at home, on graphics, on all the little elements that you might see on the overlays of showing the viewer, like, when these things are happening, which parts of the track they're allowed to do it in, because it feels like it's going to become a real, there's some tracks just one DRS zone. It feels like this is going to be across almost all of the track. There's going to be different zones where you can do different things, and it's important that fans stay on top of that, isn't it?
Yeah, but what we need to tell the fans is that it's probably not going to be a performance differentiator, in the way that it's not going to mean the difference between overtake and not an overtake, because everybody will be doing it. It won't be like the DRS now, where the car behind has to be within 1 second of the car in front, and then the car behind gets to open his rear wing flap, and then that gives him an opportunity, or her an opportunity, of going past. They'll all be doing that. So with the wings, so we just need to explain why that is. That's why I think this X mode and Z mode doesn't really matter so much, because we're not going to be saying, and he goes into Z mode and finally goes through the corner, and then he gets him under Z mode, because they're all going to be doing it. Another thing for 2026 is that they're going to have effectively a overtake button, which they have at the moment. It's called the overtake button, but they're going to call it now the manual override power boost button, or something like that. It's called manual override. And it's weird, because we already have that. It just gives an extra boost, a battery at a certain point, but you can't get it for free at the moment, because you still have to charge your battery. And what I don't get, what I haven't understood, is whether the FIA is saying that will remain the case, and that if you do drain your battery by pressing the manual override and trying to get somebody into a corner, say that you're, I don't know, in Canada, you're Lewis Hamilton, you're trying to defend from being re-overtaken by George Russell on the straight, so you can do your manual override to defend. What I don't understand is whether that's just a software thing, and you'll be able to, like in Formula E, like a sort of attack mode, or whether actually you will have to pay that back in harvesting more electricity. I think it's the latter, in which case it'll be no different from the manual override mode. But yeah, what they're calling it, the FIA, I'm going to read it, because shall I tell you a story well, I'll tell you what they're called first of all, then I'll tell you the story. So it's called the Z mode, which is when the wings are closed, and the wings are like that. So the wings are closed. That's the Z mode. And then the X mode is when the wings are flat, and that's the X mode. So they're quicker in a straight line. Now, can I tell you a story of why they're called this, and how we found out about why they called it? So there was a press conference in Canada between the press, and not between the press, including the press, and Nicholas Tombassis, and Jan Monchot, who are the two head honcho technical directors from Sporting Director, technical director of the FIA. And I went in there. Martin Brunner was in there as well, and everybody asked their questions. And I thought, someone's bound to ask, why is it called X mode and why is it called Z mode? I already called it Y mode in the day before, so I'd already got it wrong. So I thought, I'll wait, because this is for the Britain press, not really for the TV people, but we're allowed in there. So thanks to the FIA for allowing us in there. And then nobody asked, and it got to the end of it, and I thought, oh, no one's asking. I put my hand up, and while I put my hand up, Nicholas Tombassis, who obviously had a meeting to go to, looked at the press guy from the FIA and kind of went, no more. I don't think he'd seen me asking my question. And the FIA guy said to Tombassis, okay, last one. I was like, no, I've got a question. And then Jan Monchot came to the end of his answer, and the press guy from the FIA said, right, no more questions, please. Everyone has to go. Tombassis was up, had to go to, obviously, as some technical director at the moment, had a pressing question about the Canadian Grand Prix. And I was like, what about my question? That didn't put me off, Matt and Bernie. I did then ask.
Intrepid journalist you are, Ted.
I did then ask,
Good.
as they were walking away,
yes,
why is it called the Z mode and why is it called the X mode? And they said, well, it's to do with, Bernie, you're going to like this, being an engineer, it's the Z axis and the X axis of a graph.
Yeah.
So the Z axis is the vertical up and down. So up and down is when you get the vertical movement, meaning downforce. Downforce can push you up, and then it goes to push you down. And then the X axis is the longitudinal axis. Is this right, Bernie? And that means that you're quicker in a straight line. And that is why it's the Z axis and the X axis. And the fact that I had to A, write it down, and B, read it off my notes to remember it shows you why I am not a physicist or an engineer, unlike Bernie, and why I think that is going to be quite a hard sell to the viewers, some of whom aren't physicists or mathematicians or engineers, who might not get it. And I think we have to think very carefully about how we communicate it, and maybe say he's in DRS. We had DRS in 2011. People know what it is. And if they don't, that they can ask drag reduction system. I don't see what's wrong with just still calling it DRS mode and it being both wings.
That's exactly why, that makes sense when I heard the answer. But that's how all of the regulations are written in those axes. Every regulation, the technical regulation for the FIA is written in those axes, like how far something can be above the Z plane, all these sorts of things. But that's why engineers shouldn't name these things. I agree with it in the technical regs. It's hard enough to read in there and understand and get your head around. It's not universal across all motorsport. It's, F1 runs a system. So someone should rename it. I agree that, keeping the DRS, but we're going to have to accept that it can be used all around the track is a pretty good naming convention. And, maybe someone from marketing, I'll rename it, hopefully.
Yeah, it feels like a Soho-based marketer comes in and really
keeps DRS
works out what I'll just call it DRS. Everyone knows what it is already. That's a really interesting explanation, I think, of what to expect for 2026. My final point on that, which was just a kind of reaction to what Lewis said on the regulations, where he sort of questioned if they're going to be slower. And Bernie, I wonder, does it matter if these cars are slower? If the ultimate aim is to get better racing, to get more nimble cars, and that word is been used quite a lot with these regulations, if they're slower per lap, does it matter?
If they're slower relative to now, probably not. If they're slower relative to the junior series, yes. So, if we end up in a position where they're slower than some of the other series that we have available, I think that is a problem for F1, because you're meant to be stepping up through the series. And slower, in what way? But I think nimble, we all agree that the cars need to be more nimble. Unfortunately, the regulations come out after Monaco. We didn't get a lot of overtaking. We never get a lot of overtaking there. So I think a smaller, and road cars need to go that way as well. Getting smaller physical cars is good. And then we need to look at, how are we getting the sort of green technology that we want to do it? How are we attracting the engine manufacturers? There's bigger overall questions for me in that. I guess the first thing to say is all of us, engineers in particular, probably reasonably stuck in our ways, don't like big changes, potentially obvious. People are quite negative when they first come out. Can we get to a point where we get, the cars that we want, the overtaking that we want? Ultimately, what we want is good racing. So if we can get a good racing, then we won't worry so much about the ultimate lap time. But I think, my personal opinion is we cannot be reducing it more than the other series. And I don't have a feel for what the engine aero combo is going to do at the moment, I don't have the capacity to sort of do the sims on that. But yeah, I would like to see us employ some, one of the ways that you could easily, I was just thinking about it over the last few days, one of the ways that we could easily make the cars lighter is go back to refueling. With the moment in the cars that we currently have, we've got 100 kilos of fuel in that car. So you could easily lose 50 kilos at the beginning of the race just by doing that method. But then you bring back the complexity of refueling, and there's a drive away from fuel towards the electrical energy. But the fuel, which we've not talked about, which is going to be sustainable fuel, is really exciting. I think that's a massive step forward for the whole, aerospace industry mainly, because that would be our jet fuel. And that, that's significant if we can use that fuel. But if we can use that fuel, then the question mark is, do we need the battery power? So there's many, many question marks that exist going forward in terms of how the cars and the engines are going to look.
The reason that they wanted to get these rules in the first place was to encourage new manufacturers to come on board, to keep Formula One relevant, to keep development going and making it relevant to the good of automotive, to support Formula One's future, which they've done. Sustainable fuels is absolutely massive to turbocharge the scale, the scalability, and the affordability of sustainable fuels. Adding no new carbon to the atmosphere is absolutely massive, and something Formula One can, will, and should be shouting from the rooftops about how we've turbocharged the development of that, where it's just been, sustainable fuels, we'll get there eventually. 2026, Formula One put a deadline on it, and that has really advanced the development of that, which is great for everybody.
Just to clarify, when we talk about the sustainable fuel coming in, the sustainable fuel, the current process is that we're going to take carbon that's in our atmosphere, that's been put in the atmosphere, process that and create a fuel. So the fuel still, when it's running in the engine, creates carbon in the tailpipe, but the idea is no more carbon than it's taken from the atmosphere. So carbon in to carbon out is hopefully neutral and sustainable. There's a lot of work going on in the energy that it takes to make the fuel, but that is the process that hopefully by putting it in an F1 car, we begin to improve that process, get some, economies of scale behind that process to make the fuel cheaply and more readily available.
Right, Bertie, because it's a hydrocarbon. This fuel, petrol is a hydrocarbon, right?
Yeah.
So you're taking what, hydrogen? You're just taking those carbon.
You're just taking the carbon molecules that is in the air around us.
Yeah.
The air is full of water and oxygen and a whole host of things, but carbon is in the air. That is what the carbon emission from your car is. And you take that and you reprocess it into a fuel. So the idea is that you are not, by burning that fuel then later on, you're not adding any more carbon to the atmosphere than you've took out. Now, the big part of that process is how we get the energy, because obviously it takes energy to make that fuel, how you make the energy green. So if you can do that through a solar farm or whatever the case may be, then you can have, a totally green fuel. One of the things that they're looking at is fuel in a tank is easy to transport. So in a tanker, it's, the transport's okay for that. So if you could produce that fuel in Africa or somewhere that's got a readily available amount of solar power, then potentially you can do it green enough at vast enough quantities that we need to do it.
What I think they need to get right is for it not to look silly that one engine manufacturer can somehow generate electricity much easier than another, and that you get them both going down straight, and one of them just goes backwards and the other one just goes forward past them. It can't look silly, which hopefully it won't. Hopefully it will be closer racing, which I'm not sure it will be, because every time you bring in a new rule set, there are some people who get it very right and some people who don't. And we're just having the current buzzword in Formula One, convergence, on the grid. So it's just now in 2024 and 2025 going to get really close, and we're going to change it for 2026. So maybe there's a discussion to be had about how quickly and how soon we make big wholesale rule changes. But as I say, they made this rule change because they wanted to bring the manufacturers in, which they've done with Audi, with Ford, and with Honda staying on. And the third thing I think is that they need to be more raceable and close. And one of the quotes of the weekend from Canada, which I was surprised to see, which I don't think got enough traction, if you like, Matt, was Nicholas Tombazis saying, I think this was an interview to Racer magazine, saying that we got some things wrong with this current ground effect cars, which remember what a big thing about it was, that we were going to make these cars race closer together, and it was going to be tighter competition, and they were all going to be able to follow each other. And Tombazis, I've got the quote here, a significant part of these regulations was talking about the fans. We believe we made a step closer to racing in 2022, but there were also things we got wrong, and we're trying to get it completely right now. And I don't think enough attention, put the computer away now, I don't think enough attention has been made on that. It's like, wow, there were some things we got wrong? Did we? How did that happen? And how can we make sure that we don't get these costly in money and time rule changes wrong ever again in Formula One? Because then it is truly a waste if we have got it wrong. And Tombazis is saying there are only some things we got wrong. that's just a waste of time and money for everyone. We don't want that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen.
Yeah. And it's crucial for the commercial arm of Formula One as well, isn't it? You know, closer racing and having a really good product to sell around the world to broadcasters and fans is key. So yeah, there's a lot riding on it. So much more, I'm sure, of those 26 regs is going to become clear across the rest of the season. So we'll keep you posted on that. We're just going to do a very, very quick, because I appreciate time is getting on, very quick Spain preview. And I'm gonna say this, and either of you can agree or disagree. It's something I said in the podcast last week. The most eagerly anticipated Spanish Grand Prix of recent memory, I think.
Why?
Because of what that track, which allegedly is the sort of kind of middle ground, the kind of the testing track, the one that will give us the real sense of where the teams are at. It's a big weekend for Red Bull because they obviously won't have the pesky curbs, they will have curbs, but they won't be as pesky as they've been for them in the last few weeks. Are Mercedes back? The times will literally tell this weekend. And then you got Ferrari, who didn't score points at all in Canada, trying to make amends, and also McLaren being there or thereabouts pretty much in every race this season. So that's my very, very brief summary of why this is a very, very eagerly anticipated race. I don't know if either of you agree with that. Or can remember a more eagerly anticipated Spanish Grand Prix in the history of the 50 or so years that we've been going there?
I can't remember 50 years ago, Matt, but and my memory's terrible even for the seasons that I was doing it. So to say it's anticipated or not, but I think you're right. It's a very different track to some of the tracks we've had more recently. We'll get a better read on the upgrades that McLaren and Ferrari have got. Have Red Bull genuinely slipped down the order? So that we will answer some questions coming out of this race that we don't know now. Some people will say that this is more the track that should favour Red Bull, but we don't know how the McLaren and the Ferrari upgrades are going to work, or indeed, have Mercedes genuinely got on top of the gremlins that they've been troubling them for the last few years.
Ted, it's going to be upgrade city, isn't it, in the pit lane this week?
There'll be a few, yeah. I mean, the most of the upgrades in Canada were circuit specific to that: larger brake ducts, smaller rear wings, that kind of thing. So like Imola, this is the second tranche of major European season upgrades that are going to have to last here: Silverstone, Austria, Budapest, and Spa before we get to the summer break. So yeah, there are going to be some upgrades. I think in many ways the team for which this is the most crucial Grand Prix is Ferrari. I think having had the delight of winning Monaco, which is obviously like a bit of a world championship win for them, but very significant, I can easily see a podium of Max Verstappen first, Lando Norris and or Oscar Piastri second, and George Russell and or Lewis Hamilton third. I can easily see that podium. In fact, I might, put a little sportsman's bet with you, Matt, on that. And the big question then is it Leclerc fourth? Is it Sainz fifth? Are they not going to have quite the pace on that kind of circuit? And that's the big question that I don't know. And I think Ferrari don't know potentially as well. They didn't really have the learnings because of circumstance with the electronic problem that Leclerc had and the bash with Albon that Sainz had. So for me, it's where Ferrari fit in there. But I can absolutely see three manufacturers, three teams, McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes on that podium.
Well, that in itself is a very exciting prospect for us in Formula One in 2024. So, hooray! We've got a nice and competitive season. It appears. Just time to tell you about the timings for this weekend. I'll try and rattle through them. It's the first of a triple header, our first triple header of the season. We've got 5 races in 6 weeks before the summer break. And as well as F1, we've got F2 and F3 and F1 Academy across the weekend. Friday, we're on air at 12 p.m, building up to FP1, following F2 qualifying around 3:35. We're going to look ahead to FP2. Saturday, FP3 is on air at 11:15 before qualifying starts at 3 o'clock, building up to that from 10 past 2 after the F2 sprint. And then Sunday, it's a race start of 2 p.m, building up from 12:30. So plenty. I mean, you literally don't have to leave your sofa this weekend. If you so wanted, you could watch motorsport all weekend. I suggest you do get some fresh air.
I will be watching it.
Yes. You'll be at home watching it. Very nice, Ted.
Bernie's borrowing my headphones, so I'll be pit lane this weekend.
Trying my best to fill in for Ted. Trying my best.
So much more competent than I could ever hope to be.
Good Birkenstocks to fill, I'm sure.
I might pack those.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Ted. Appreciate your time. We're going to be back next Tuesday to look back at the Spanish Grand Prix. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.